Hi, I'm Nick from CCIC.
And I'm Lindsay from the Discourse.
And you're watching
Views from Women Deliver.
Hi, welcome to episode 4 of Views from Women Deliver. It's the third day of Women Deliver here in Vancouver, and it's not quite as sunny today. But we've got some big themes that have been going through the conference, and we're going to be talking today about, in particular, breaking barriers of access to power. And we're going to be talking a little bit about sexual and reproductive health rights, and I think also about, the lessons that we need to be learning about improving the way that we deliver humanitarian response in more gender-sensitive ways. So welcome to this episode, and we have a new co-host today sitting in for Erin, Millar.
Yeah, my name is Lindsay Sample. I'm the managing editor at the Discourse. I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, and we're joined by two great guests, and I'll just ask that you introduce yourselves. Perhaps we could start with you, Rachel.
My name is Logel Carmichael. I'm the head of humanitarian affairs at Save the Children Canada.
And my name is Davidson. I'm a program manager on the global health team at Care Canada.
So, you've been here since the beginning of the conference. You've had a chance to see what's going on and probably are getting a little bit tired of all that you've had to do. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about your impressions at this stage. What are some of the things that you've been participating in that have really marked you?
Sure, I can get us started. It has been a bit exhausting. These are long days and there's lots of sessions, and it's sometimes really hard to choose what to go to because there's so much that's interesting and relevant to our work. But I think it's been really amazing to be with a group of people, such a large group of people, there's 8,000 of us here, that are really working towards the same goals. And I think there's just kind of a sense of being sort of refueled, to keep doing the work around gender equality and moving the needle on sexual and reproductive health and rights. So having that opportunity to learn from other organizations, activists, colleagues from countries where we're implementing programming has been really rich and valuable for me so far.
Yeah, there's so much content here. And it even started before the official conference started. You, Rachel, were at the humanitarian pre-conference. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. It was a day where practitioners and policymakers and decision makers came together to discuss humanitarian affairs in particular, and looking at the topic around a feminist approach to the humanitarian system. So also I would say that, being inspired by the group of people that were there, as well as in the different sessions that I've attended, is it really motivates you to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and stay here until 10 o'clock at night. But in terms of what came out of the pre-conference, we had the chance to listen and learn from civil society organizations that are coming from conflict and disaster affected places, and I think to situate their important role in that last mile of the humanitarian system, and to think through each of our roles as actors within that system, and how we look at the power we hold and the structure and barriers to ensuring that each part of the system has adequate representation of gender equality, or advancing that, but also where those barriers are creating blockages for women's right defenders in that last mile space as well.
There is a lot of power between donors and their NGO partners, and even more so with civil society, at a grassroots level. Mm-hmm. And so you were in a session that was trying to unpack that a little bit, and hearing lessons from CSOs.
That's right.
So what was emerging? What do you think donors may have taken from that session?
Well, we talked quite a bit about barriers related to funding and influence, and I think that there was a real feeling that the civil society groups who are in really inaccessible places, who have often are having their voice projected through the filter of the UN or the INGOs, is really limiting for them to be able to acknowledge and show what they know, what they're experiencing. So I think donors heard that there needs to be clearer opportunities for those two groups to come together without the barriers in between. And so looking at ensuring that civil society organizations can come up to the spaces, coordination meetings at the humanitarian country teams, the UN Security Council, where there's opportunities to project the needs and issues related to accountability and such, and occupy those spaces, but then also donors coming to the place to understand really what those key issues are, and not, again, having that filtered through other levels or voices.
Yeah. And I'm really curious about this conversation around civil society and power in this context, and especially here at Women Deliver, where there is a lot of power in who's speaking on what panels and who's in the room. And how have you guys been finding that?
Yeah, I mean, I have been really happy to see a lot of representation from local women's rights organizations, and I've been seeing space shared, or power being shared with larger organizations to create space for those voices that aren't heard. Just to kind of build on what Rachel was saying, I've heard a lot around the advocacy around the Not Optional campaign. There's an interagency statement that 40 organizations have signed, really advocating for money from donors to go directly to women's rights organizations in conflict-affected areas so that they can respond. And so that's been a real big theme for CARE in terms of getting signatures and support on social media to support that. But I think it's been really important to see the opportunities as well in some of these conflict settings. So we had a session this morning called Youth, Sex and Rights, and we were talking about some of the work that our partners are doing in Syria. And we had a really interesting discussion about gender transformation in times of conflict where everything is shifting, and men might not be around. And so depending on how we respond, there is this actual opportunity in a very difficult environment for gender norms to change very quickly. And how do we as NGOs and civil society responding support that, and providing greater access to information around, for example, sexual and reproductive health services, where that might not have been available previously. So in a really difficult environment, there's still real opportunity, and we have to be aware of that and support that as much as possible to support more equal gender change.
That's really interesting.
There was an example at the beginning of the pre-conference in the similar line of thinking, where the discussion was around, during the World Wars, where women were brought out of the kitchen and into into factories and places of work, and then brought back, and how that disruption created this opportunity you're talking about. And so with those difficult circumstances, there's opportunity, and sometimes there's back and forth, and we have to work with that adaptation. And just I think one thing is hearing this week a lot of really interesting models and ways to approach humanitarian assistance, approach SRHR and gender equality in these types of difficult contexts as well. So this is a great opportunity, this type of conference, to hear from not the usual suspects who we're meeting with on a regular basis, and having companies and thinkers bring forward approaches that we can all sort of look at how we change the way that we're doing our work as well.
Yeah, I've had some really interesting discussions around using a design approach as well. So I'd heard a lot about human-centered design. I'm like, don't we already do that? We consult with communities, we hear what they want, what their needs are, but really using very playful, creative ways to engage communities, especially young people who often are hard to reach or are not necessarily involved in the traditional consultations or community engagement activities that we do, and how to prototype and test different ways of working with young people has been really interesting for me, at least, to think about how we can kind of shift that needle. And building on and connected to that youth piece is also how do we support youth advocacy and youth-led organizations and movements and create space. CARE is a big organization. We do a lot of population-based programming. We're often very linked at the hip with governments in country because we're implementing through them, but how do we take some of those resources that we have and funnel that and create space for youth-led organizations and movements to really grow and do their own advocacy and write their agenda, So there's been some really interesting discussions about that as well, that I've been really around shifting power and creating space.
Were there any any of those playful engagement examples that really you're like, I want to try that?
Yeah, they had, so there was a couple of really interesting projects that I heard about from this organization that was doing sort of using design, and some of it was around moving away from bias with healthcare providers, and so doing a lot of work with young people, using mystery shoppers to identify, like to send youth in and to hear what their experience was of accessing services, and then going back and kind of like a positive inquiry place, coming from a positive inquiry place, but sharing this back with the provider, saying, we know you're doing the best job that you can, and you're working in really difficult environments, but we have to change this if we really want to like move the needle in terms of health outcomes for young people. And then developing really interesting social behavior change communication materials, but that are beautiful and like, you know, like thinking a lot about the look and touch and design, which I don't think we necessarily do in public health so much. So there's some really interesting conversations about being a bit more creative. Yeah.
But that's an interesting point around communication. I was really struck in some of the things that I heard today around how we use language and just the important. There's some really big lessons that have come out, you know, in recent years around the language that we use. And I was hearing talk from. I'm afraid I forget her name, but she founded the Slut Walks from Toronto, you know, and just owning the words and making us understand how the language that we use comes with so much baggage and puts people in certain places. But also, and I think you may have heard of this project, the Pleasure Project, and sort of looking at how we can talk about things differently, that we actually have created stigma in places, and so it really does matter how we present something. Like when we talk in the SRHR space, we historically have really used very scientific language, often pretty fearful about, you know, if you do this, you'll get that, or diseases, and there are so many better ways that we could be communicating if we were aware of sort of what we transmit by the language that we use, the images that we use. There's really a lot in there around breaking down power and access to things.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Just as an example, family planning. So young people don't feel included often in the term family planning. They're not planning a family.
Right.
You know, so just, you know, by the terms that we use, sometimes we exclude populations that we're trying to reach.
I attended a session today that was focused on advocacy and campaigning in the language of incorporating gender equality into that language as well, and looking at different tactics that are very focused on, you know, the type of audience and the message that you're trying to you know, get across, and just thinking through like what youth want to hear, what governments need to hear, what different you know, folks within different levels of governments, the way that you're approaching them with language and describing things. It's all very relevant. Yeah.
It certainly is.
Yeah, there's an amazing campaign that in Lesotho called Rola Katiba, which was all around sexual health with condoms and trying to get men, like the onus being on women to put forward that you should use a condom. And so in Lesotho, these Basotho hats are really big. So it's literally like cartoon and it says, wear your hats, gents, and like, and it did really well and just was like fun, playful, creative, and really like push the envelope to try to get men to be thinking in that way too. So yeah, it really resonates with me.
Yeah, I also attended a session today where the Pleasure Project was part of the panel, and it was really really interesting because traditionally we talk about, you know, maternal mortality, you know, STIs, you know, not getting pregnant, and we don't really talk about, you know, pleasure. And, you know, there's a lot of research that suggests that if we start from a place of pleasure, then there's a greater reduction in STIs and greater use of contraceptions in many places. So it was really interesting to kind of think about changing the narrative. And it was a fun session because then they split up the audience into groups, and we had to come up with a 30-second advertisement for contraception, the male condom, the female condom, and I'm forgetting the other one. Oh, consent. And so people had to go on stage and act out an advertisement. So it was very interactive and fun, but a really important topic. So yeah, it's all food for thought in terms of how we move forward in our programming and think differently.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of lessons here around power, and it's just been amazing to see the youth participation in the conference too, and speaking truth to power. And I mean, we've seen it right through the conference, and I think I've said it in a previous episode, but I remain stunned by Natasha on stage on the first plenary, and just what is possible with a generation that is coming up that is owning their voice. You know, I think that's really incredible to see. So for me, I mean, while we're talking about very difficult topics and so much progress that we need to make, I don't think we spend enough time realizing the progress we have made too. And speaking about narratives, you know, there was also a session yesterday after the Prime Minister made his announcements of additional funding for mother and newborn child health and for SRHR. There was this presentation about the gap in awareness. You know, that actually, yes, things are bad in the world, but they're actually a lot better, and that we generally, and even participants of Women Deliver, significantly underestimate the progress that we've made. And so we've created very negative negative perceptions of the world. On average, in OECD countries, people think the world is worse off than it was. And in the US, I think it's 2/3 of Americans who believe the world is worse off. And in that context, it's very hard to make progress. People are sort of holding in on themselves. They're sort of in a siege mentality about things like refugees or changing social norms. And in fact, it makes me wonder how much our sector is part of that, because a lot of the majority of our communications are fundraising based, and they tend to focus on the negative. So we put the negative forward to fundraise. I'm certainly taking away lessons with respect to that as well.
I agree with you, but like linking to the youth piece, I mean, youth in fragile contexts and humanitarian crises are, the largest group of people that make up the largest demographic that we need to be focusing on. So it has been amazing this week to see those youth leaders come forward and for us to really amplify what their issues are, because that needs to be present for all of us who are making space for them to come up and make some of those decisions.
Yeah. So.
I think at the same time, though, there has been a real sense of solidarity and the need to continue to resist and to push in the climate that we're in. Yeah. And so I think, that it's been really a great opportunity for so many people to be in the same space and to reaffirm that commitment, and to see governments committing as well, while there's so much pushback. So, while I think it's great to celebrate our success, I think, I feel very much, sort of a renewed commitment to resist at home here as well, and support our colleagues and the organizations and partners that we work with and where we're implementing programming as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, in Ontario, what's going on there in terms of sort of the rollback of sex ed, and so there's still a lot that we need to defend and fight for here.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about that.
And I think the interesting thing, like the linkage between, I don't work in this space every day, but as a journalist, like when we're talking about narrative and when we're talking about whose voices get heard and who's considered an expert, I think about that a lot, especially when we're thinking about youth engagement and these kinds of things. And so I think for me, this space is really about in part the stories of tragedy are fueled by that daily news cycle, which is so focused on the problem. And we've seen that this week in so many ways, especially with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry report and the reporting on that. And, so I just really think about reconsidering who counts as an expert, and you see that here in terms of who's getting an opportunity to speak, but also how do we as the media do a better job of genuinely listening to people and not just going to the same usual suspects to present us with the same information, because we're missing a huge part of the picture, and I think that intersects with so much of the work that all of you are doing.
I like that a lot of the panels and the hosts of the panels have made an effort to bring some of those voices in, even though it's difficult. There's simultaneous translation. There are people who are doing sign language. There's ways to make it accessible for both those on the panel to speak their various languages and communicate, and then the audience to hear that in different ways too, which I think is amazing to get to step up and do that.
But you have to be deliberate about it. We have to be aware of these things, and then we have to make the choices that force ourselves to do things differently. And it's not obvious, but I think that's what we get out of here, is the reminders of of what we can do different. So, I mean, we're talking to our colleagues in the CSO community. What do you think that they should know about, what's been going on here? If there was one sort of thing that you're going to walk away with, what would that be?
For me, I think, power in each of our positions. We look at, the theme is power, but sometimes that, the enormity of the issues just seem to weigh on everyone. And again, when you have 8,000 people coming together, there's a groundswell. And so there's a lot of collective action, I think, is building here. But we as individuals have a responsibility to look at, within our own sphere of influence, in our homes, in our communities, in our organizations. And so that responsibility, taking that back and really working to bring forward some of what we've heard and learned this week.
Yeah, I think for me, and while I already, felt that this was important and this is a big part of my work, it's been a great opportunity to learn about different ways of sharing and amplifying the voices and lived experiences of women and girls from different parts of the world where we're programming. I attended a really interesting session on data and how working with women from communities to actually collect data and then present it back in forms where they're generally excluded, and to create space for their political participation through the use of data. We're kind of, sometimes it's an extractive industry, I've heard, data collection, but really putting that back into the hands of the communities in which we're working. It's just been really wonderful to think and learn about how we can do that better, to continue to create space and amplify women and girls' voice from around the world.
That was our 4th episode of Views from Women Deliver. Thanks so much for tuning in.
And join us tomorrow for episode 5. We're going to talk about the role of youth in gender equality.